Lauren, welcome to the podcast. Good to have you.
What is going on, Brian? Great to be on with you today.
Yeah, this will be a fun conversation to go through your journey a little bit. I know we caught up a little bit in the past week or so. So again, good to connect here deeper. And you know, everyone has, and I'm sure obviously you have people in all walks of life you meet of like all these unique stories, these different ways of like how you and I together here today, all the information, all the knowledge, all the things you've learned, you have some unique path that's so different than everyone else. So I'm really curious to hear your story, especially around the things you went through. We can go into kind of some of the tragedy you went through in your life and kind of how you were resilient to improve that, if you will. Here's where I wanted to start, though. A lot of folks struggle getting started because their identity, the way they've been, doesn't line up with maybe the person they want to become. It's like a different person. And I love this idea you have about falling in love with your story and really owning who you are, because I think we have a lot of, shame, there's a lot of self-doubt, there's a lot of comparison bias, like someone else has things that we don't, and really just loving who we are and then building upon that. So I'd love to start there, your thoughts around how you came to that, falling in love with your story, and then how you exercise that in maybe your daily life.
Yeah, that's great. First of all, I love the shirt. Just get started. I know you're repping
Thank
the
you.
brand because you know what? We all have to start somewhere. And that is one of the biggest things I talk about, especially as a sports reporter, navigating life, navigating different challenges, right? Like everyone has to start somewhere. So when you see the vision of the athletes, right, that are hoisting that national championship trophy, like they started somewhere, whether it was in childhood, throughout their life. And it was a journey. Those football games and that one season, 12 plus games in the regular season, obviously championship games. It took them a while to get to that place, and it was a building blocks. And that's what I've discovered in my journey personally, that it's building blocks, right? And we all have to start somewhere. And I think that's kind of where my journey of, as you mentioned, falling in love with your story begins, and of course is certainly continued to be written, because falling in love with my story was something that did not come easy, especially as you talk about shame and circumstances and things that we all are faced with. And for me personally, the hardest part of my story and one of the biggest chapters in my story that really I was faced with the greatest challenge was when I lost both of my parents to prescription drug overdoses just within 5 hours of each other when I was at Rutgers. I was a freshman gymnast there on scholarship, living out my dream and thought I had it all there. And then tragedy strikes and I, learn about the loss of my mom, and then 5 hours later, my dad. And I think the biggest piece of that that was so hard for me is because you use the word addiction and overdose in that sentence with both of my parents, and there's such a stigma attached to it, right? And society has created this stigma of what addiction is and what an addict looks like. And I felt like my parents were none of those things, and I just could not accept the fact that they had died from overdose, much less their passing in general. But then having to explain that to people was so hard. And so I just bottled it up, Brian, for years and years and years and years, because I wanted to keep this facade, right? I wanted people to think, oh, well, like she comes from a great family. Her parents were loving, they were supportive. And I felt like when they had addiction attached to their name, overdose attached to their name, then suddenly they were none of those things. And that
Mm,
became the hardest part of my journey, and being able to learn to fall in love with my story, especially that chapter that has obviously spanned multiple chapters of my story. Learning to fall in love with that has been a journey, and one that is not linear. That has definitely taken some dips and dives and weaves and some ins and outs to get to where I am. But ultimately, I see this vision of these shackles of shame that I was attached to, that when I
mhm.
finally fell in love with my story and started sharing it openly, I was able to break those chains and have the freedom that I have now to be a voice, not only for my story, my parents' story, but a voice for others who might be experiencing, difficult circumstances.
Yeah. Do you remember when was the first time you shared out in public?
Yeah, so it is interesting because when I go back and sort of timeline things out, because here's the thing, we process things in segments, right? And so there's things that I remember about the journey, and then there's this black hole, and I'm like, okay, what was going on there? And then little things that I remember and pick up along the way. And specifically, they died when I was 18. I was at Rutgers. I was a freshman. I went back to school. I got back into a routine, wasn't accepting of what happened, just kind of buried it, kept going, and really just stuffed this thing so deeply. And I use, when I look back at the timeline, I look at about the 7-year mark. So Brian, it took me 7 years to truly be able to come to grips with what ultimately happened. Because what was transpiring is my auntie Linda, my mom's sister, who really took me under her wing along with my uncle Mike, would tell the story. When people would ask, they would be more open about it. This is the truth. This is the reality. And I would literally just go fisticuffs with them. I'm not talking about it. I'm not sharing their story. That's not what happened. You're lying. And I would just come apart. I would just have a full come apart and just could not accept the fact. And so after about 7 years of just literally this internal battle with myself and with my family and my support system, I finally just started to recognize that this is the reality. This is the truth. And I need to learn to stand in that truth. And I think really when that came to fruition was when I realized, and I think my auntie Linda was a big proponent of helping me to realize this, my parents aren't defined by how they died, but by how they lived their lives. And when I started to recognize that, I realized, okay, I can't change how they died. I can't change that they were ultimately drug addicts and got addicted to their prescription medications that were prescribed by a doctor. I can't change that outcome, but I can change how I present that to people and how I own that story and use it to help other people.
Mm. Is your aunt and uncle still around?
They are, yes. My
Oh.
auntie Linda, Uncle Mike. It's amazing because I had a great relationship with my auntie growing up. She was there. I was born in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I was a Navy brat, so my dad was in the Navy, and so
Oh,
she was actually there overseas, like there the day I was born. I was the girl she never had. She had 2 sons, and so we were super close growing up. But having that support system was huge for me. And even though I was 18 when my parents passed away, I was such a kid, uh, did not know how to operate in this life that we live in. I was so focused on gymnastics and schoolwork and scholarship, and I'm going to get this thing done. I was in this tunnel vision that I could not process all the things that it requires to be a human being, an adult in this world that we live in. And so they really came in. My auntie Linda and Uncle Mike came in to save the day. And some people laugh about that. They say, Auntie Linda, are you an aunt person, Brian, or are you an aunt person?
I say aunt. That's
See?
just,
Yeah,
I
you're
don't know.
you're 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 I
It could
guess
be the New Yorker in me, though. I don't know.
I was about to say it's got to be the northern thing. I think I don't know. It's just funny because it's always a conversation when I say Auntie Linda. They're like, "Where did that come from?" So I would say
Yeah.
auntie. I'm an auntie person.
And we'll probably loop back around to this, but as you said it, I'm kind of curious now. And I'm making up a story in my head as I hear this. I'm kind of curious for you, like being in the military, like under that realm, how did that impact you as like from athletics and being a gymnast? Because there's some discipline there to build that. Did you learn that from your dad, or was that just something that you think came innate from you?
Yeah, I think it was twofold. So my dad ended up serving in the Navy for about 5 years. So truth be told, I didn't really see his military career in action because we were in Guantanamo Bay for a year, moved back to Roanoke, Virginia, where I'm from. And at that point, he ended up getting out of the service after 5 years. But I will say this, my older brother, Alan, wanted to pursue the military. So military was woven in to our family and the fabric of our family. And I would say that it was very much a part of like that structure and discipline. And you mentioned discipline. It very much was a big piece of things. I just remember growing up when we would go to restaurants and the waiter or waitress would come over and ask to take our drink orders. And, if they would ask a question and if I did not respond with, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, no, sir, no, ma'am, my dad would let me have it. And he'd say, yes, what? And he would give those disciplinary actions of like, there is respect. And so respect was a huge part of the family dynamic for us, without a doubt. And I would say, I think that disciplinary piece of it was very much present in that regard. But in terms of my parents handing out discipline, totally different story. And with my book that I'm releasing later this summer, I really kind of dig into that. And it's interesting because, when you think about discipline and military, like there's definitely that big dynamic. And I was a very disciplined athlete growing up as a gymnast. Like gymnastics takes such a high level of discipline. But yet when it came to being disciplined in other areas of my life, if, trying to stay, within the guardrails of being a teenager and different things like that, I was pretty good at pushing the envelope a little bit with my parents. And they weren't always really good at handing out discipline because, I was the child that, always did things right and kept things on the straight and straight. And so there was always this high level of trust, but also I always was really good at sweet talking my parents into like, pushing the curfews a little bit and all those things that come with being a teenager.
What ultimately got you into gymnastics? Why did you fall in love with that?
Yeah, so gymnastics, interestingly enough, because I'm sitting down right now, but y'all, I'm 5'9" and I'm very tall. And as you know, I'm a monstrosity when it comes to the gymnastics world. Of course, when I was 3 years old and my parents enrolled me in the sport of gymnastics, nobody knew that I was going to be some, prodigy. I don't know that I'd call him a prodigy, but I definitely advanced at a pretty quick clip early on in my career. And then of course, growth spurt happened, injuries happened. And, I stuck with it long enough to be able to earn that college scholarship. But I would say a lot of it was just the energy that I had as a kid, bouncing off the wall, swinging around on the monkey bars. I was just this like agile, little child, that just was a ball of energy that could not be slowed down. And so finally my parents are like, all right, we got to do something with this girl. And so really it was just a sport. There's no gymnastics really in my family and or background. It just was a sport that they enrolled me in early. I fell in love with it, and it really truly became almost a full-time job, when I was in high school going into college.
Mm. What are some of the lessons I think, and maybe we can relate this to someone starting, whether it's athletics or something else. What are some of the keys with gymnastics you think you carry with you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we talk about discipline. Gymnastics requires that discipline. I would also say gymnastics is one of those sports that, you think about the fear factor, right? Gymnastics is a sport that is extremely difficult and requires a lot of courage. Okay. And I think one of the best examples we can talk about is Simone Biles, right? In the 2000 Olympics that obviously took place in 2021. There was a lot of scrutiny that came to her because obviously the GOAT, and I will say she will 1000% go down as the greatest of all time, just with her skill level and what she's been able to accomplish. And it amazes me that she's at the age she is still coming back for more. But seeing that happen to her from a mental standpoint, it's like people like that don't break. People like that don't run into fears. People like that don't have setbacks the way that she did. But in the sport of gymnastics, it is such a mental sport that you've got to truly have the mental capacity to literally gut it out, grind through injuries, grind through the pain, get up every morning. I just remember rolling out of bed in high school and in college, like ice bags strapped to my legs, like just literally like, just limping to the kitchen to go make breakfast because it was just the constant grind on your body, physically and then mentally. So I think that really what I would say gymnastics has probably taught me in many ways, as I relate it back to the sport and maybe through my life, my window of tolerance, right? So I think I've got this window of tolerance that is pretty significant and that I've been able to like compartmentalize things. So I have this window of tolerance, things happen, you box it up, you throw it on the shelf, you move on, you push forward, you grind it out. And I think that in many ways probably maybe was a benefit in some ways when I did lose my parents, because I was able to kind of have that resilience factor that was built in from the years of just the stress and the ground and pound that was on my body physically, and then of course mentally and emotionally from the sport of gymnastics. And I know I make it sound like it's just the most difficult and like grueling sport in the world. It's also extremely rewarding, and it's a sport that I love to watch. I love to cover it at ESPN when I have the opportunity. But I would definitely say that's probably something. The window of tolerance is something that has probably been a big benefit to me in many areas of life, to be able to kind of control some of the things I can control and sort of forget about the things on the outside that I can't.
Hmm. Is there I'm curious to know more about that, like, because when I hear tolerance, and maybe this is where definitions, like, because I think of, like, pain tolerance, like,
Uh-huh.
being like, about walking in the kitchen and, putting try to have breakfast, but, you were hurt, but pushing through that little extra, you don't have to go David Goggins style, but, like, being able to, like, do things when you're hurt, you're not feeling your best, and pushing through the next level. But when you think of tolerance, you're thinking of it more of compartmentalizing and not, and almost like pushing that away. Is that how you deal with it then?
Yeah. I think that's a great point too, as you kind of explore the definition of tolerance. Yes, I think it is twofold. The tolerance, as you mentioned, that's the physical tolerance, being able to, you know, uh, get past those ailments, the things we feel physically. But I would say, especially from a mental standpoint, the window of tolerance, being able to compartmentalize. And I'll use this as an example. I told you my parents died of prescription drug overdoses. My dad was an alcoholic as well. And growing up, I knew that he was an alcoholic. I didn't understand the term. I had no idea what that meant. I just simply knew that my dad had a drinking problem. When he would open up a bottle of, whiskey, vodka, whatever it would be hard for him to put it away. And so he would go on a weekend bender. And I just remember my mom telling him, hey, go back to your AA meetings. And it would cause some, tension in the family. There'd be some arguments. And I will say there were many special occasions that were often, I don't want to say ruined, but definitely impacted greatly by his drinking. And that was, primarily because with his drinking, his personality would change. You would become kind of ornery, just a different person. And also, he would make poor decisions in that drinking stupor, right? Maybe spend money that wasn't there. Have to take off extra time from work. And so he would have to dig into his retirement with days off and all those different things. And so I would say my window of tolerance also was that of the fact that I could love my dad, um, see him for who he was as a daddy's girl over here. Obviously, he'd fall off the wagon and it'd be a weekend of just almost like misery, having to deal with the fallout from his decisions. But I was able to just compartmentalize it. And that next Monday or Tuesday when he would sober up, I would love him just the same. And it was almost like that weekend never happened, or that birthday that maybe he decided to drink and I had to kind of deal with the fallout from that never happened. And I was able to really box that up and compartmentalize it and move past it and still have that same love and affection for him that I had, whether he was drunk or he was sober.
Well, I know you were 19 when they passed, right?
18. Yep.
Or 18. So,
18.
did you ever have the opportunity to ask them directly about, like, being an alcoholic? Like, have that conversation?
You know what? It's crazy because I do think that in that window of tolerance we talk about, the compartmentalization, I think a lot of those tough conversations never happened. I think partially because I would often turn an eye to it, a blind eye,
Mhm.
not acknowledging it because I wanted to believe that my parents were perfect and that they had it all together and they were these just great people, which they were. But like us as humans, all of us, we have flaws. And I never really got to have that direct conversation with him. I knew when there were issues. I knew when there were struggles. His service in the military, he did deal with some depression and some PTSD along with his chronic pain. But there were times where I would mention to my dad, hey, things are going to get better. And I would be encouraging, but I never really addressed it from a standpoint of, hey, dad, you got a problem. You need to go get help. I never really had those conversations with him. And I think a lot of it was because, number one, maybe I just didn't believe that it was attacking him in the capacity that it was. But number two, I was so young and naive that it took me going off to school, obviously experiencing the tragedy and the overdose, and the addiction that they were in, to look back and go, oh, wow, that's what that was.
Mm.
And so it's interesting because at 18, looking back, I think I do wonder, and Brian, this is probably the first time I've actually been asked that question. So first of all, great job. Um, but thinking about that opportunity to have that conversation, because my parents died in silence, right? They did not have the courage to speak up about their addictions, right? They were walking through this path to addiction probably for about 3 to 4 years, but it was a silent battle. And now looking back at it, I wish I could have had those conversations, perhaps if I would have been more educated or understood what addiction was, what it looked like, and maybe having some of those tough conversations with my parents and saying, "Hey, maybe we need to get help. Maybe you need to look for another avenue. Maybe we need to find another doctor." And it's hard because when you're a 15-year-old, 16-year-old, you're young, you're immature. Like, there's so much you don't know. And there's so many things I wish I would have known then, because perhaps we could have had some of those maybe tougher conversations that would have maybe perhaps driven them and encouraged them to go find the help that they needed.
Mm. Yeah, because I think about that a lot. I mean, obviously, my parents are still around. I didn't have to go through things of that nature, but like even just I think of conversations I have now. Like I'm very, and I guess I'm curious where you're at with this. Like I'm very direct with people. I have very hard, difficult conversations because ultimately that I think gets you to a better spot in your relationship, whatever relationship it is. Versus when I was younger, it was you don't talk about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shake it off, don't talk about it, move on, be strong,
Yeah.
kind of that type of thing. And I think the encouragement I always give to not only parents but also younger kids and adolescents is like talk about these things. I know it's difficult, but you have to expose it. And to your point, like if you don't talk about it, you never know. It's kind of that sometimes you live with that regret of like, God, I wish I said something. Well, we didn't know any better back then. I think we
Yeah.
know now. Have difficult conversations. It's important.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, hindsight's always 2020, right? And you don't know what you don't know. And I think I was naive to it. And my parents did a really darn good job of hiding it from my family. And I'll say this, my dad overdosed at Thanksgiving when I was a freshman at Rutgers in my first semester. He overdosed at Thanksgiving. I was home, and it was completely brushed under the rug. I left Thanksgiving that weekend, got on a train, went back to Rutgers with the thought that my dad had a bad reaction to medication. So in my
Mhm.
mind, it was, oh, he struggles with bad, cholesterol and, blood
Mhm.
pressure and those things. In my mind, it was a concoction of drugs that shouldn't have mixed, and it ultimately caused him to have respiratory failure. So,
Mhm.
I think back to that, and even just how naive I was then, that my parents could truly, that could happen. And then the same day, my dad goes off to a psychiatric ward to obviously be evaluated. And we go back home and have Thanksgiving dinner as one big happy family. Like, what, you know? And so when you look back at that, you think about how crazy that is, and just how much there was a false sense of reality that was just being painted throughout the course of our lives, especially there towards the end, when my parents did a really good job of masking and shielding us from the truth and the reality of what was going on behind closed doors.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's like I said, hindsight is always 2020 because we love to do that, but unfortunately, yeah, sometimes you don't know.
You don't
But
know. Yeah. Which is
well,
also why I'm such a big advocate for having these conversations, right? Because I now have, a young one here at home, um, just turned 9 months old. And I think about, some of the conversations I had with my parents, but I never dabbled in anything. I don't drink alcohol, never did drugs. And I think a lot of that was the gymnastics, the discipline. My focus was so much on that sport and being really good and competing at a high and elite level in that sport, that I think part of that kept me away from it. But I think about those conversations and how important it is for me now to enter into those conversations with my son when that time comes, that I don't want to shy away from it. I don't want to, distance him from the realities of what our world and society operates with. You mentioned the comparisons, right? Social media will tell you this is the what you should do. This is what you should look like. This is how you should feel. And oh, maybe if you drink this or smoke this or take this, it'll make you feel good, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think that that's the problem is we're living in this world that has so many filters, and these filters make us see things in a different way and through a different lens that is completely a false sense of reality, and ultimately drives people to maybe make decisions that aren't the best for them. And so, as a parent now, coming full circle, seeing the you know the way my parents dismissed a lot of things in their lives and with us, myself and my brother, I hope that I can use that as a lesson. While there were many things they did well, there were also many things that they could have done better. And perhaps that's something I can use as now a new parent, as I kind of navigate this. And that's why I'm such an advocate for these conversations, because I do want to get in front of parents and in front of people to say, hey, to your point, Brian, sometimes you just got to have those tough conversations. Nobody wants to have them, but it's important because ultimately you could be saving a life or many lives for that matter.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's generational in terms of, like my parents are in their late 60s, so that kind of dates me, right? I was born
Oh,
in
they're so
83.
young.
But that like whole idea of like, like 80s, 90s, like that was like again, the way the parenting was back then. We don't say anything, you move on. I look
Yeah.
at it now, I have an almost 12-year-old, and we talk about a lot of things.
Mhm.
And I love that our conversations are very open, and he's open with me, which is great. But I even think about like conversations we haven't had yet really around like drugs, which is something, I mean, especially with this whole, opioid epidemic with fentanyl being laced and all this stuff. Like I'm scared as can be because he's like the nicest kid in the world and I think he makes good decisions and judgment, but you get around one friend,
Yep.
you take one thing the first time, and that could be the last time.
Mhm.
And that scares the hell out of me as a parent. But would I rather not have that conversation because it might be whatever? No, like let's have it. Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
I'd rather him have more knowledge than less, right? And
Yeah.
that goes to anything. That's insert whatever. That could be about guns. That could be about whatever,
Yeah.
drinking, etc.
And
So I
and do
think
you
it's
find that he comes home to you a lot and has those do you find that he um, initiates a lot of those conversations, or is it mutual? Like, what does that kind of look like in your household with those conversations? Is it something that he is, quick to ask questions and say, "Hey, Dad, I want to know more about this," or are you usually trying to find an entry point where you can talk about it?
It's both. It's actually mutual. He'll ask questions. He's very curious about things. Um, and then obviously I ask in a way, I try to figure out a way where it's, I mean, sometimes it's direct, but sometimes it's like, oh, how did, oh, tell me about more about that friend or what, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And then kind of get some more insight. But um, I made a couple decisions a handful of years ago that I think really helped from a parenting and my relationship with him, because I don't think I was the best parent early on. I had a lot of my parents, not again, I think my parents did a good job of what they knew, but they also had a lot of things they didn't do great.
Uh-huh.
And I had that in my early parenting, and I really had to check myself of like, what path am I going down as a parent? Anyways,
That's
what
good.
I changed, and this may be helpful to your question, is there was two things. One is I took the approach, Neil deGrasse Tyson, I love his approach of like all kids are scientists. And what happened when we were kids, most likely, maybe this didn't happen to you, but you spill something, what happens? You get yelled at, or you do
Mhm.
something wrong, you get yelled at. But the approach of if you think all kids are scientists with their learning, well, if they spray something like if they're in the sink playing and they make a mess, well, let's not yell at them. Let's ask them, oh, what were you trying to do? What were you trying to accomplish? So that curiosity comes out more and more, and it takes away the conflict. So that was one big thing I
Good.
enacted
I like that.
in
Yeah.
yeah, my training. The second thing is I almost never answer his question directly. I generally throw the ball back in his court. So if he asks a question, like let's say there's a song on the radio where, whatever, we're driving down the road and he's like, "Oh, what does that mean?" Instead of being like, "Oh, it means this," and move on, I'd be like, "What do you think it means?" So I want him to answer first, so it kind of churns in his brain, and then he may be like, "Well, I'm not sure, I don't know," and we talk through it. So that I feel, and again, I don't have the dots of every single second, but I feel those type of things. He's felt more independent, more feel like he can share with me and not like get like yelled at or anything like that. So we have a very open dialogue and communication, which I absolutely love. And that's
Awesome.
I think helped our conversations. I hope that goes. Hope that doesn't change as he gets into more adolescence and teenage years. But yeah, I've been appreciative of that.
That's really good. I love that insight because it's something too that my wheels are turning over here as, I'm trying to learn to be a parent, right? Trying to navigate this life of parenting now and what that looks like. And again, taking lessons because, you're in the same you and I in the same camp, and I would say a lot of people listening to this probably feel much the same way, right? You learn some great things from your parents, and there's some things, or your caretakers, whoever that might be, and then maybe some bad habits and some things that you don't, want to do. I think about those commercials where you see like, don't be like your parents. And then all of a sudden you start to see yourself like as you're entering into this like phase of parenthood and being, grown and entering into the like second half of your life. And you're suddenly like, oh my gosh, like I am becoming like an old person. I am, becoming like my parents, the things I said I would never do. But I
Yep.
think that's such great insight. And, I think that's why we're here, right? Conversations are so important. Conversations are really such an important part of who we are. And you talk about, from the beginning of this podcast, falling in love with your story. To me, it's those connections, those conversations, and those connections that we have with people that we can learn and to grow. You plant seeds, you water them, you watch them grow. And I think that's the great part of humanity, right? The great part of relationships is being able to have open-ended conversations, learning from one another, because at the end of the day, like we don't have it all figured out. I don't have it
Mhm.
all figured out. You don't have it all figured out, but we can learn and grow together. And that's why having these podcasts, having these open-ended conversations can be so beneficial because I listen to things like this and say, man, I never thought of it that way. You asked me that question about, just discipline. And then of course, that window of tolerance, like it's never been presented to me that way. And now all of a sudden I'm reflecting on something that I will probably continue to reflect on when we hit end and
Yep.
we finish this recording. And
Yep.
I think that's what ultimately helps us to grow and just to become better people and better positioned to serve others with the knowledge and experience that we have and the things that we've walked through.
Hmm. Speaking of conversations, this is maybe a nice bridge to walk over. What ultimately led you to want to get into sports reporting? Talk to people.
Great question. So it's interesting. When I went to Rutgers, I actually had dreams, hopes, goals, aspirations of being a sports doctor. And that was supposed to happen by going to the Air Force Academy because the thought process, there's the military piece again. The thought process was like, oh, wow, that can pay for my school. That can get me through med school. And, finances was a big issue with our family at times. And so that was sort of the ticket, right? And so that was the hope that was going to happen. Unfortunately, my SAT scores didn't make the cut.
Hmm.
And the second time around, they didn't make the cut. And the third time around, they didn't make the cut. And so I just finally said, all right, well, I guess that's it. So obviously, Rutgers ended up being, the next best choice, but in my opinion, a great choice and ended up being, a great fit for me. And uh, I still had wanted to pursue sports medicine at that time. And I think a lot of that was being an athlete, being surrounded by athletics in my life, but being so, involved in the world of sports and understanding like, the pain that you endure and the injuries and really just the heartache. Like, you get knocked down, you break a leg, you break an ankle, you have back injuries. I dealt with all that stuff. And then having to get back up and piece it all back together and still try to live out your dream. And in my case, my dream of becoming a collegiate athlete on scholarship, and watching that start to dissipate in front of me. And so my thought was like, ooh, sports doctor, I can do that, and help athletes get back out on the field of play. And then I realized, after my parents passed away and my grades were slipping and I was failing miserably and legitimately failing out of school, that's when I realized, like, wait a sec, like I need to find something I'm more passionate about. This is not something that I see myself doing long term. It was a childhood dream, and realized, okay, we got to go in a different direction. And so, after some conversations with people at Rutgers, we had a lot of support staff there that kind of helped navigate some of those conversations to say, okay, if you're not going to go in this direction, would you be good at? And I think for me, what stood out about sports broadcasting is, of course, there is something to be said and fun about like, oh, you get to cover sports for a living. You get to go be on TV. Like, hey, look at me. Like I'm on TV. Like that's kind of cool. But I think too, what has come full circle for me, it's the relationships and it's the storytelling. And so I love to tell stories. And I think that's one thing I saw is that as an athlete myself, just getting to see those stories of success and then, of course, failures as well. But I think that's really what's come into my focal point as I've gotten even further down into my career as a sports journalist is the stories that I believe, really captivate people and have an impact in a positive way.
What was your first like big on air interview? Do you remember?
First big on-air interview. Well, I will say, I had to really kind of work my way into, this world that I live in. I live in Birmingham, Alabama currently, and this is SEC country. And of course, Nick Saban has recently retired, which is hard for people to fathom that he's now former Alabama football coach. Hard for me to say, but I would say as I ventured into broadcasting, there was a couple different things I did kind of early in my career, but one of the bigger interviews that I was able to do was with Coach Saban. That was an exciting one. And then another one was Broadway Joe. So that was kind of a cool opportunity. No, he was not wearing a fur coat at the time. I think he was wearing a suit, but that was a really cool interview and opportunity. And that was really early in my career as well. But that's where I really had to learn how to kind of like silence the internal fears and that intimidation factor. Because when you get into a room with, a coach as great as Nick Saban, and you have to build up that trust factor, right? And when you don't quite feel like you have that trust and sort of that relationship with them, it can make it difficult. And so I will say the longer that I'm in this career and the more that I talk to coaches, I love to go back to a stadium or back to cover a team that I've covered multiple times under the same regime because I'm familiar with that coach. Or even if they were at a previous school and now they're the head coach somewhere else, when I see them again, there's a level of familiarity and there is a
Mhm.
level of trust. So they feel like they can sit there and tell you a lot of things, tell you some of their internal thoughts, and know that you're going to handle it with care when you broadcast that to, 2+ million people on game day Saturday.
What's your preparation process look like, I guess? Like, do you prepare a lot of your questions or do you kind of like to do more off the cuff?
Yeah, so there's a very high level of preparation that goes into obviously the job. So we get our game assignments on a Sunday, book our travel, we're on a plane Thursday, and obviously covering a game on a Saturday. And of course, this is college football that I'm speaking on. But in terms of preparation, I mean, I'm starting that preparation on Sunday. As soon as I get my game assignment, I'm looking at both teams because I probably haven't really been covering that team very closely because it's, this team versus that team. I haven't seen them all season. And so you're diving into the depths of that team, the playmakers, the stories, the pain points that they're dealing with, and really digging under the surface. And so there's a really high level of preparation that gets you into that game throughout the week. And then we have our conversations with the coaches, which to me are so valuable. Usually we talk to the head coach and the coordinators and then maybe a player or two. Super valuable because you're really getting to the core of that team. Because, you can watch press conferences all day long. They do these press conferences, but when we get to sit down, whether it's via Zoom or in person, we get to have these in-depth conversations. Sometimes coaches like to go off the record, which is always fun, so you got to protect that information when they say, well, this is off the record, don't mention this. But, you do get some great insights from these coaches and just kind of understanding, where they come from and what drives them and sort of the philosophies that they follow. And then in terms of the questions, especially in game, they're a little more laid back when it would be sitting here, you and I, like obviously, just more of a conversation. But when I go live on TV and have to have, 2 or 3 questions prepared, I think going into a game, I sort of know the theme of the game and maybe their pain points and what they dealt with last week. Hey, your defense struggled. What did you work on this week to really focus in on X, Y, and Z to prepare you for a team that obviously has a high-powered offense that, we'll see, get the ball down the field, whatever it is. And, I will have questions like that sort of prepared in my mind, but, you have to be, it's one of those things, it's twofold, right? You want to be super prepared, but also you want to be very, inquisitive. And based on some of the questions you sent me about what we're going to talk about, that's what I love about these conversations. We kind of had a plan going into this, but you've also asked a lot of great questions and follow-up questions based on the answers I've given. And I
Mhm.
think that's obviously what makes a good reporter. That's what makes a good host, is being able to prepare, but also fly off the cuff and have some of those more in-depth conversations and Q&As that kind of drive a little bit deeper than just some of the surface level things.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think it's good to have, and I've probably changed my tune on this over the 7 years doing this of like wanting, I would rather have some more information. Like, and I do a lot of prep, typically 30 to 60 minutes, depending on the guest and what information's out there. If they have videos or other stuff, some don't have as much. But then, yeah, I kind of navigate away from that. Sometimes we don't even talk about any of the questions I sent. It's just, they're totally different. So just based on the conversation and where it goes. So I think that's important. I think having both of that's beneficial.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
wanna be able to kinda, skate the line on both sides of it, and again, I think that's what makes, these conversations so beneficial and powerful, is when you can kinda dig under the surface and you can have the prep done and you can understand someone more than surface level, but also dig a little deeper and maybe get into the roots of some of those, questions that you originally had, planned for the show.
Yeah. Um, Gosh, there's a lot of areas I want to go. We've covered a lot. Let's just end on this one because I'm actually really this has been top of mind for me. I had um, Jess Ekstrom on. I don't know if you know Jess, but
I
she started.
love Jess. Jess is
Yes,
the
okay.
best.
I just had her on the podcast, and I got to actually interview her in person here in Raleigh, which was kind of cool.
Oh, fun.
But she's doing this mic drop workshop where she's really empowering women, to speak their voice. And what I'm curious from your perspective, because you obviously got into a very male dominated industry. So I guess there's an encouragement because I'm really trying to. It's one of those things too, and I talked with Jess about this in our interview. Like even like people that reach out to be in the podcast, it's like 85-90% male,
Mhm.
and it's just like for some reason women maybe don't feel like they should be on the show. I don't know. So it's something I always, when I have the opportunity to figure out, okay, where could you share advice from your side of the house, if you will, of being in this male dominant industry. If someone is trying to either break in, whether it's sports broadcasting or something else, what encouragement would you give for women to get started? Some things maybe they should consider, or at least look in the mirror and ask themselves, so they don't stifle their growth.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question because honestly, when I got into sports broadcasting, I don't think it was something that was really super defined in my vision of like, oh, I'm about to enter into this male dominated world. And then of course I get into it and I'm like, oh wow, like, this is going to be a challenge. And a lot of those challenges, just come in different ways when you're competing against different people that have, maybe played the sport, right? I've never snapped a football in my life in any sort of competitive play other than out in the backyard,
Mhm.
right? So I'm competing against people that may have played the sport, that have, been on a different side of it. And having to prove to people that I'm just as knowledgeable and that I can bring an element to the broadcast that is just as, beneficial and, helpful than anybody else, that might be involved in it. And so I would say just, some advice that I would give to women, especially who are trying to kind of navigate this, male dominated industry, whether it's this or something else, is, I think just get started is one of the biggest things is, I think we stand in our own way a lot of times because we put labels on ourselves, right? We talk about confidence. We talk about those internal battles. We talk about the comparisons. And I think that women are very much emotional beings. And, I've heard it said, and I think this is really interesting. And this brings us back to the world of addiction. And it makes sense because I think this shows us sort of kind of a component that is relevant in all areas and facets of life. But, men typically that are in recovery tend to relapse when things are going really well, when they're celebrating and life is good and money's coming in and jobs are great. Well, women, on the other hand, tend to relapse and fall back into old habits when uh, things are not going well, when maybe they have a bad breakup or something detrimental happens to them at work or whatever that may be. And they tend to, be consumed by their emotions, which then sends them down that path to old habits. And so I think that is where I would say women, we tend to internalize things, we tend to personalize things, and
Mm.
we grab onto the different things that society tells us. And I think that's where we get in our own way and have fears of just getting started. Right. And so I would just encourage women. I would encourage you, if you're a woman out there right now thinking, well, I want to try this, I want to do this, why be mainstream? That's one of the things I think is like, I love the idea of being able to kind of step out of the lane that people say I'm supposed to be in and try something different. I like to be different. I like to kind of buck the trends. And not everybody's comfortable in that space, but I would just say try it. Step one foot out. Try something different. Try something unique. Because at the end of the day, that's only going to empower you to take that next step and to continue moving forward and mowing forward. And yes, you're going to run into situations where maybe there's not a lot of confidence because you're a female. Maybe there's a little bit of that doubt. But that's one thing that, I always like to push back on. And to me, if you prepare and you go in and you do your job and you prepare the best that you can and you're as knowledgeable as you can be in that arena and you present yourself in a very professional way, then you will earn that respect. And it might not happen overnight, but that is one thing that I'm so thankful for, that in the world of sports and in the arena of being a sports journalist, earning that respect can be difficult, but it's something that I enjoy doing. And once I've earned the respect of those coaches and those athletes, and you realize that they're human just like us, then you kind of break down those walls and you disarm people. So I would just encourage you again to just get started. Step one foot in a different lane, try something different. And if it doesn't feel right, then maybe veer back into the lane that you were in. But unless you try, you'll never know. And
Mm.
so that is something for me. I had no idea that sports reporting and driving into this industry would become what it has. I never knew that I would end up on ESPN one day and doing what I'm doing. Of course, I'm so grateful for it. But there was a moment in time where I compared myself to Sam Ponder, who was on College Game Day. She's a year younger than me. And I remember looking up at this tiny little TV on the top of a refrigerator at a run-of-the-mill hotel and thinking, oh my gosh, like I'm never going to make it to ESPN because I've missed my mark. And I did this whole comparison game. And then I realized, wait a second, Lauren, like pump the brakes. Maybe I'm not ready for that yet, but my story is different than her story and is different than your story. But that
Mm.
doesn't make your path and your journey any lesser than. It just means you took a different avenue to get there. And I think that's what I want to encourage people is like own and embrace your story and the path that you take to get places, because it's also going to give you a whole lot of gratitude when you finally step foot into that arena that you've been chasing for so long.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great, I mean, you made a lot of great points there. I mean, the one thing I'd underscore is when you prepare, when you go after what you want, and even if it doesn't work out, listen, rejection happens. Things
Yes.
aren't fair. That happens, but you you earn respect to yourself. Like the negative self-talk maybe isn't there as much because you're like, you know what? I put time and effort in this. I gave it my best. I could do it again. I could try again. And I think there's just that little extra confidence internally because we all have this negative self-talk. I mean, maybe some have it more
Yes.
than others. Shit, I dealt with it for so many years. It's still a struggle, but it's a hell of a lot better. And I'm sure the same for you. If we can just figure out a way to say, all right, I'm trying this. If it may not work out, if it does, phenomenal. But even if it doesn't, what am I going to learn from the experience? And then
Mhm.
let me take that to the next thing. And you're one step ahead just by doing that. And
Yep.
I think that's a huge thing for folks.
And you definitely start to silence those voices and that self-doubt in your head. And that's one thing I've been working through myself because again, I'm a communicator, I'm a storyteller, I do all those things. And then I also find myself, speaking truths. And then I can't even own those sometimes in my own head. And I'm like, wait a second, Lauren, like you can't be speaking like that to people and telling people those things and not following and living by that. So I do think that you can quiet some of those noises and voices in your head, the more that you can go through those things. And so if you don't get super repetitive, because that's what I'm notorious for doing, is repeating certain things out loud of, maybe things that I've done wrong or gone in a different direction. And then as I say it, the more I say it, the more it becomes the truth and the more it becomes prominent. And then it's the voice that's pinging back to me internally. And then I don't get out of that rut that I'm in. And so speaking, beyond those things that maybe take us down, those risks that we take, which, as you mentioned, you do it, you get rejected. What's the worst? What's the worst that can happen? They say no, you send an email, hey, I want to be on your podcast. What's the worst they say? No. Okay, moving on. It's not personal. You just got to move on and try something else. And at some point, you're going to break through that, that door that is seemingly in your way. And you're going to say, okay, that wasn't so bad. All right, now let's move on to the next thing. So I love that, talking about internal voices, because I think a lot of times they speak all too loudly and we got to turn them down.
Yeah. Just got to keep moving forward and realizing that, God, I've learned this lesson so much, even just doing this podcast, but like, I mean, you could say that every no gets you closer to a yes. Yeah, sure. And you can say that, but the reality is that we have to be willing to ask. You have to just be willing to ask and let what happens happens.
Yep.
Because we can't control a lot of stuff, but what we can control is the ask. And if
Yep.
we're not even doing that, we're never going to get down the line further, right? If you just ask once and like, oh, this sucks, no one's going to, whatever, I'm leaving. Well, you're never going to make it because you lack consistency. You have to keep moving the ball down the field. Throw a sports analogy in there. But,
Let what happens happens. I think that's a really good truth right there. I think that's something we can both lean into. Let
yeah.
what happens happen.
Yep. You can't, I'm a big, I don't know if you like the Stoic philosophy, but I'm big on stoicism, but like, we may not be able to control what happens, but we can control our reaction to it.
Absolutely. Yep.
And
We have a
that's a great,
choice. We have a choice at how we're going to respond to adversity. And I think that's really an important key to all of this. And, it starts with having that trust in yourself and, just the willingness to step out of, step out of those fears and just go after it.
yeah.
And you'll get knocked down. But guess what? You get the opportunity to stand back up and take one step forward.
Yeah,
So,
I love that.
yeah.
Lauren, this was a lot of fun. If folks want to
No.
say hello to you online, where do they go? Where do you spend the most time?
Yeah. So, website, laurensisler.com. So come check it out. Got some great stuff going on there. I mentioned I have a book coming out, so I'm excited to share that with you all. So if you want to go sign up for some updates, I'll send that along with some great stories and some more insights. But I spend a lot of time on Instagram is probably where I spend a lot of my time,
Okay.
posting pictures, family photos, just out and about. And of course, if you don't know, you don't know. My sideline shimmy, I like to dance on the sidelines. It's kind of my thing that kind of tamps down the nerves when I'm out there doing my thing. So, just come follow along. And if you want to connect, shoot me a message. DMs are open. Love to hear from you. Would love to hear your story. Would love to connect with you. So, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. I'm everywhere. But just shoot me a note. And thank you again, Brian, for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.